Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Welcome to Werewolf Wednesday, starring me, Nancy Levonian in Hollywood. We've got an extra long show for you tonight, and we'd like to kick it off with a scary werewolf tale that we call
The Dogman Days of Autumn. Dear Scary Stories NYC. My wife and I bought a house 17 years ago when we retired that we love living in. It's exactly the perfect vision of our dream home in every way, except that once a year for 7 to 10 days, the property becomes overrun and infested with savage and dangerous dogmen. We moved into the place in spring, and to be honest, that was the happiest time in our lives. Some people have a hard time adapting to not working, but we took to it like a cat being introduced to catnip. We had a thick patch of trees at the edge of our land which connected to a larger forest, so we would get to see animals that we never had seen back in the city. There are these gray hedgehog things, I still don't know what they're called. They burrow in the ground. We have 4 different types of squirrels here, and more different bird species than I knew existed in the continental United States. We also love our neighborhood and love to stay current on local events. The very week we moved in, we attended farmers markets and yard sales and grand openings, and began to feel as though the culture of that place was in fact our own culture. Although we were newbies, we felt more at home than we ever had before, and we had made more new friends in those first few months than we had in our entire lives up to that point. Retirement, for us, was the day we were reborn into much lighter and more fun lives. That initial period of intense and continual happiness ended quickly, and with a sickening thud, as we had our first encounter with a dogman. In many ways, this is still, to me at least, the most terrifying thing that I ever lived through, and it was much worse for my wife. One night, she asked me to take the garbage out, which was one of my jobs. Jokingly, I reminded her of how many of her jobs I had performed for her in the last few days leading up to that. I pretended I was tired and said she owed it to me to take the garbage out this time. I was just joking around and trying to get a rise out of her. I had every intention of taking the garbage out once I had kidded her enough about it. To my surprise, she took my joking seriously, and in a huff, she grabbed the garbage bag to drag it out to the cans. I mean, she stormed out of the house, and you could tell that she was in a bit of anger. This hadn't happened since well before we had moved into that house, so I was kind of stunned that she was acting like that. This was the kind of thing that used to occur sometimes when we both had jobs and things got tense, but I'd never seen her be so nasty in response to me joking around before. It was so surprising that I literally didn't know what to do at first. Then, I figured I'd better go talk to her, so I got up and walked to the back door. I was unsure of what I was gonna find, since I wasn't sure why she was angry in the first place. But no matter what I thought I might see, I certainly found something far more surprising than any of the possibilities spinning around in my head. A scream jolted me. My wife was shouting from outside as I opened the back door to look out. What I saw sent a cold shudder through me and made my knees buckle. I had to hold on to the door frame just to have the strength to witness this. But what I saw was my wife on the ground, garbage bag next to her, and she was looking up at something that must have walked up from the underworld as far as I'm concerned. It stood like a man, but it had the head of a dog. I felt nauseous just witnessing it. Yes, it was a dog man, but it was also something very evil. It was not just an animal. People want to classify this as some new species, but this was not something meant to exist on our plane. This was a big, hairy, slimy, matted hair, smelly kind of garbage monster of a dog. It was messed up and had clearly been the survivor of a multitude of extreme fights. It towered over my wife, leaning down and looking at her with amazed and angry eyes, smelling her and studying her various scents. I'll try to describe the monster's appearance. It was a top-heavy looking thing. The legs were longer than a bear's legs but short relative to the body. They had to be massively strong to hold up the rest of this creature, as its chest and head were like a tyrannosaur practically. I'm exaggerating, but not by that much. I mean, this thing had a head made for biting and chewing. It was practically a land shark in that sense, but it also had long, muscular arms with scary, dangerous-looking claws at the end of its hand-like paws. The main feature on this creature was its shoulders, which were like a football player with his shoulder pads on. They were just huge, and its dog-like head was sunken into them. Its long and strong arms looked tiny coming out of all that muscle mass. It gave off the impression that it was the strongest creature that had ever lived, and that it might also have been the angriest and most agitated as well. Its manic way of panting and studying my wife kept her screaming over and over again. I didn't know what to do, so I grabbed my baseball bat and took a step outside, looking for something loud to bang the bat on. Not seeing anything, I swung the bat into the side of the house, and it made a loud cracking noise that caused the Dogman to look up in my direction. Once it saw me, it started growling and snarling and barking ferociously at me, but it was taking steps backward away from my wife as it did so. I swung the bat into the wall again and motioned to my wife to start coming back toward the house. She kept laying there instead. I said out loud, "Come back to the house now, but do it slowly." To my amazement, she said she couldn't because the garbage was on the lawn and needed to get picked up. "I'll get it in the morning," I hissed at her and her weird sense of priorities. As she started crawling away from the monster, it made a move back in her direction. I slammed my bat hard and loud into the house and started shouting at the Dogman to get its attention again. As my wife got up and ran back inside, I shouted so much at the ugly beast that I gave myself a sore throat that it took a week to get over. We were horrified and traumatized by this experience, but it gave us a good reason to talk things through in more detail about our lives and our relationship. For instance, she is no longer allowed to take out the garbage, and before she gets angry at me, she asks me if I'm serious or joking first. Seeing her being threatened by a large land predator was not something I was emotionally prepared for, and I've become extremely protective of her since then. We saw other dogmen later on, and we could mainly tell them apart by their various injuries or deformities. They clearly led a dangerous life, this clan of dogmen, and they are a clan, traveling together in a loose-knit pack, spending much of their time alone as they do so. We've never seen two at the same time, but we would always see more than one during each period when they were in town. Although neither of us has any health issues yet, we're both getting up there in years, so I decided to get a live-in nurse to stay here with us. He was a very large man, and that was the other reason I chose him. I wanted a young, able-bodied individual around at all times for the sake of my wife. After all, it's getting harder for me to swing my baseball bat each year. So, the first day that our live-in nurse arrived, the three of us all saw another one of the dogmen racing down our driveway and out behind the house to the woods nearby. I mean, we were talking, and this thing ran by, and then we all ran into the next room to watch it run into the woods. He, the new nurse, had heard of dogmen, and he started telling us all that he had read about them, as though we had never seen one of these things before. We never told him that they were the reason we hired him. It seemed better to let him be the expert on the subject. He stayed with us for 5 years, and it wasn't until year 3 that all of us realized that the Dogmen only appeared one time per year. They came in autumn, and they stayed between 1 and 2 weeks, usually around 10 days, the Dogman days of autumn, as my wife took to calling them. Once we realized this, we sat down and tried to remember which dates we had made sightings on to plot out when they had been there and guess about when they might return. It turned out they had come as early as the first week in September and as late as the first week in November. The only constant was that they were always gone again in under 2 weeks. These days, we now have a staff of 3 people, and they all know full well about the Dogman. 2 of them have seen them, and I have little doubt that the 3rd one eventually will as well. We've adapted to a peculiar lifestyle where each fall, we are all on the lookout for the Dogman. Once anyone has a sighting, or once my wife starts getting the heebie-jeebies, we close up for a 2-week break. All our help knows they get 2 weeks paid vacation in the autumn. They just never know when it's gonna be. So far, this has been working out for us, although we are both aware of how precarious it all is and how things could crash down at any moment. So far, the Dogmen have only been seen at night, so we just stay indoors after dark during the season when we know they might reappear. Everybody who has worked for us has their own theory about the origins of the monsters. Some think that they are a migratory pack of creatures and that autumn is just the time when they head through our area. Maybe they're coming from north of us and heading south for the winter. The rancid looking and smelling nature of the monsters has led others who are more religious to suggest the theory that they are demonic and only manifesting in the autumn because that's the season when the veil between the 2 worlds is thinnest. A non-religious variant on this theory is that we have creatures used to living in underground caves and caverns who only come up to the surface during this one time of year for some seasonal reason that has to do with stuff that we don't understand about the alleged worlds under our feet. About 8 years ago, we hired our best security guy ever. He actually read up a lot about Dogmen, and he came to us with a plan for security that I still think is quite ingenious. He says these creatures are notoriously hard to get on trail cams. They seem to know where the cameras are and know how to avoid them. So, if we blanketed all the areas where my wife likes to walk around in with cameras, both still and video cameras, all activated by motion in front of their lenses, that we might be creating a safe space that the creatures would be unwilling to penetrate. And if it turned out that they can't sense the cameras after all, then maybe we'd get a picture or a video of a Dogman and prove once and for all that they are a real thing. So far, we have not captured a single Dogman photo or video, and the place seems much safer. My wife still gets a sense of when they're back in town, though. She becomes irritable and short-tempered, and we all know that means it's time for us to take a vacation and allow the Dogman use of our forest for a week or 2. And so that's our story, basically. After the first encounter, all of our sightings have been at a distance. Since the cameras have been installed, none of us have seen the creatures at all. I would have thought they were completely gone, except for my wife's yearly headaches in the autumn and her certainty about knowing when they've returned. Our security guy told me that when we are on vacation and he is still there on duty, he patrols the outskirts of the areas in which we did not install cameras. All the areas in which the Dogman might still be cohabiting with us. One year, he told me he found one very large dog-like paw print. He wasn't sure if it was the Dogman, or maybe just a very large dog. It was just the one print and not a trackway, so he couldn't tell if it might be quadrupedal or bipedal. This past year when we went away, he told me he heard a howling in the night that sent chills through his entire body. Again, not proof of anything, as dogmen are far from the only kind of canine that howls in the night. Still, I'm glad to be out of there for those 2 weeks every year. Now, it's approaching that time of season again, and I've been researching possible locations and even a 2-week cruise we might go on if the timing works out. But we can't leave until my wife says so. If we leave too early after all, we might come back in the middle of the infestation. But each day I peruse the internet and make note of good places we could visit if the dogmen come back this week, and other good places to go if they come back next week, and the week after, and the week after that, because these are the Dogman days of autumn.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with another werewolf story right after this.
And now, get ready for an all-new, completely uncensored, slightly bloody, and absolutely terrifying new Dogman story. Oh, wait. YouTube won't allow me to tell you stories like that on this channel. If you want to hear that, you're going to have to go to peterbernard.com and sign up for our paid subscribers club. You can choose any price you can afford for a 1-month subscription, and then every weekend, we tell you a story YouTube would never allow us to tell you on this channel. See you this Sunday for an all-new, very scary, completely uncensored Dogman story. My best friend was a werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a strange story to tell you, different from any that you've ever had on your channel. I believe I'm the first person to write to tell you a story about a former werewolf, because when I was much younger, my best friend was a werewolf. I had a best friend that we can call Clyde from either 4th or 5th grade all the way through undergraduate school and a bit after. He got married after that and we drifted apart, but we were best friends while we knew each other. When we were in grade school, we were both nerds of the highest order. We would draw dinosaurs and space aliens in art classes. We read comic books. We loved scary stories and science fiction and animation. We both wore thick glasses and got pushed around by the more athletic boys. We were shunned by girls, which didn't matter much to me, but drove Clyde crazy. There was one girl in particular that Clyde was nuts for. Let's call her Wilma, because she had red hair like Wilma on the Flintstones. Wilma was not very nice to Clyde. She would insult him in front of everyone and reject all his advances. Then one day, everything changed. For Clyde, at least. He came into school with his glasses missing. He told me that he didn't need them anymore, which I found hard to believe. I expected him to start walking into phone poles without them on, but it seemed as though he was being honest. He just one day didn't seem to need his glasses any longer. He seemed to have grown an inch or two overnight as well. His face cleared up, and he seemed less skinny somehow. I still was a mega nerd, but puberty was kind to Clyde. At least that was my first impression. I learned soon enough, though, that all of this came at a price. I was hanging out at Clyde's place one evening, and after dinner, he said he needed to go outside for a breath of air. I had never heard him say anything like that before, but I went out back with him. We walked across his backyard and into the woods. At night, that forest was a lot creepier than during the day, and I said so openly. I didn't want to be there, and I wanted to head back. It was then that I saw my friend begin to gyrate and mutate in front of my very eyes. It was kind of sickening, as he was twisting in ways that shouldn't be possible. I wanted to go run and get him help, but each time I was about to run off, I saw something else happen that I couldn't explain, and my attention remained focused on witnessing the strange occurrence in front of me. I was trying to think where the closest payphone was, how I could get there, who I would call when I did, and what I would tell them. I was thinking that he might be having some kind of an attack, and he might need medical attention. The thing is, the spasmodic process began to seem less and less like an illness or attack, and more like a transformation scene from a horror movie, a werewolf movie to be specific. Clyde started growing long golden fur all over him, and he became a four-legged giant canine-type creature with a savage look to him. I ran home, leaving him there to fend for himself. We were both 13 or 14, and we sort of took all of this in stride. We both knew that adults said werewolves didn't exist, but we thought adults were full of what makes the grass grow, and this only seemed like even more proof that they understood even less about the world than we kids did. We studied the phases of the moon and tried to predict when he would transform. I would steer clear of him on those nights. I had normal parents who wanted me in bed at a normal hour, but he had messed up parents with problems. They went through life ashamed and lacked the self-esteem to stand up to him. He could come in at 4 a.m. and not hear a peep from them about it. And so, that's just what he did. Although Clyde grew up overnight and I remained a nerd, he did his best to take me with him on his journey. He was fast becoming one of the cool kids in school. That girl Wilma that used to drive him crazy, now he drove her crazy. Once he started dating, he'd often find a girl for me so I could tag along on his adventures. Girls would settle for me if they couldn't get him. They would date me just for the chance to be close to him and to be seen with him. After a while, his coolness rubbed off on me, and I became a little bit less lame every day. One night, he and I were solo without girls, and we were walking home from a free concert in the park. We passed a dark area, and out came these kids from school that had bothered us a lot when we were younger. I had thought they were done messing with us a while back, but apparently they were just as jealous as ever. Their anger at us had been building, and apparently by the things they were shouting at us and accusing us of, one of the girlfriends I had recently dated was a girl that one of these creeps had a crush on. I only went out with her one time and she meant nothing to me, but it had really stuck in this jerk's craw, and now he and his bunch of buddies were gonna get even with me and Clyde in a big way. That was the second time I saw Clyde transform. This one took far less time than the original one. He definitely seemed to have gotten used to the process. He changed so fast, all of their heads practically spun. You should have seen the shocked looks on their faces when the odds went from 4 of them versus 2 of us to the 4 of them versus a 7-foot-tall, hairy, growling, wild-eyed, long-haired, golden-colored bipedal wolf monster. Now, I don't want to make it sound like I was all that badass. To be honest, when he transformed that night, I ran just the same as the bad kids did. Clyde had no complaint about that. In fact, he suggested to me several times that if I ever saw him change, I should probably split. Those bad kids went around telling everyone that Clyde was a werewolf, and boy did that help us get dates. All the cutest girls, even girls from a grade ahead of us, they became fascinated with both of us overnight. The worse things that the bad kids said about us, the more curious the girls became about us. One time, when we were a bit older, young adults by this point, we were alone again and traveling home from an outdoor concert we had attended in a neighboring state. Some jerky guys cut us off on the highway, and we soon realized they had buddies in another car behind us. I don't know what their plan was, but it was clearly not something very nice. Clyde just told me, "Keep driving," and he literally climbed out of the passenger seat onto the roof of the car while I drove down the road, getting boxed in by these two cars in front and behind. The next thing I knew, I saw the golden Dogman leaping forward off my car roof onto the trunk of the car in front of me, landing hard. The rear of the car in front slammed down into the highway, and sparks flew. The Dogman advanced up onto the roof, and that driver floored the gas. He swerved his vehicle left and right all over the road, trying to shake the Dogman off their roof. I noticed the car behind us sped up and passed us on the left, making an attempt to beat it out of there. The Dogman leaped to their car roof, and then they began swerving insanely everywhere. I just maintained a regular speed behind and watched the show. Soon enough, the Dogman leaped back to my car, and I slowed down to a stop as the two cars who had been threatening us sped off out of sight. I expected Clyde to get back in the car, but I saw him leap off the roof and run into the woods, so I just drove home without him. It seemed he could change whenever he wanted to by this point, but it was not something we would ever discuss directly. Whenever I asked too many questions, he would just remind me that the less I knew, the less I might accidentally tell someone else. I could respect that. I understood that he might need more privacy than most. I also thought he was such an incredible badass that I was eager to play the game however he thought it best to play it. Clyde had become friends with a punk metal band and started working for them as a roadie. He got me some security gigs for them, and eventually I became his assistant. Suddenly, we were on tour more than half the year and meeting new girls nearly every night. This band didn't have all that many female fans, but they had enough that we got their overrun. I was no longer living in Nerdville. I was literally managing multiple girlfriends and side pieces like I was some kind of somebody. It was a fun time, I have to say. There was a knowledge between the band and myself about what was going on with Clyde. I don't know what they had seen with their own eyes or what they had only been told about, but all of them seemed to accept on face value that Clyde had a form of lycanthropy. One time, it even came to play in a particularly crazy night in which we almost didn't get paid. I'm not going to name the venue or the promoter, and I won't even name the state, because this guy is still alive and probably could still cause me a whole lot of trouble. The short version of the story is the guy sold out the club, filled it to capacity, then didn't want to pay the band. I think we showed up late or something. He was making excuses. Then he agreed to pay the band something, but not anywhere near what he owed them. I saw the singer and guitar player pull the club owner and Clyde away behind the club by the woods to speak more privately. The next thing I knew, the club owner came racing out of the woods, crying like a little baby. Behind him was Clyde, in full werewolf form, which by this point was a nearly 8-foot-tall monster. The club owner ran inside, and Clyde ran in after him, literally blowing the door off the door frame. The club owner ran into the office, and I saw dollar bills flying through the air and all over the floor. I heard screaming from inside the office, but I don't know what was going on in there. The singer and guitarist picked up money off the floor until they felt they had been paid fairly, and we all ran to the tour bus to escape. Clyde leaped to the roof, and we allegedly, literally, had a werewolf over our heads as we drove on through the night. Now, when Clyde would transform, he wouldn't change into a werewolf like in the old Lon Chaney movies. No, he would transform fully into this kind of dog or wolf-like thing. He could run on all fours and appear like a giant wolf, but he could rear back and stand like a human and walk or run in that configuration as well. He looked pretty natural in either pose, but in neither case did he look like a normal canine or a normal human. He was something different and something in between. One of the weirdest things about Clyde's lycanthropic form was that his eyes seemed to emit pulses of energy in the form of a kind of glow that would come from them. It was like a firefly light, but less green and more orange or yellow. They wouldn't blink on and off, but they seemed to throb the color, as though the intensity rose and fell as the blood pulsed in its massive body. This was something I noticed during the period when we toured. I'm not sure it was a feature earlier. He continually mutated into a larger and larger creature as time went on. That was until Clyde met Karen, not her real name. Karen was not your ordinary kind of groupie. She saw Clyde from a mile off, and she had been waiting for him. Rather than leaving her behind as the band traveled to its next gig, Clyde took Karen with us. Soon, he became more and more bossed around, and less of a badass. It reached the point where I was cooler than Clyde was. You would think that would make me happy, but it did not. I had been living a comfortable and fun life, following his lead. I looked up to him, but suddenly, he no longer merited it. The last time I saw Clyde transform into a werewolf was possibly the scariest night of my life. Our tour bus's air conditioning had broken, and it was a particularly warm summer night. We all decided to park the bus and sleep outside in the woods along the highway in our sleeping bags. We were fearless in those days, partially because we were young and inebriated, and partially because we had our own Dogman traveling with us. So we just threw our sleeping bags onto the ground, and we passed out. This was one of those nights that just seems annoying when you live through it, but when you look back on it years later, you realize it was a major turning point in your life. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone screaming in fear. I bolted up and looked around, and I saw Clyde in his werewolf form. Relieved and immediately calmed down, I got up out of my sleeping bag to see who had screamed. In my sleepy state, I was trying to remember who, in our present company, didn't already know about Clyde being a sometimes werewolf or Dogman. That was when I got a better look at the animal in our camp, and I could see. This was not Clyde. How could I tell? Because I saw Clyde screaming and running into the bus in his human form. I ran after him, as did most of the others. Clyde's clingy girlfriend, Karen, was nowhere to be seen inside, so we couldn't drive off. Looking out the bus windows, we saw her. She was still in her sleeping bag, and she was staring at the other Dogman, petrified with fear. Now, this situation might be hard to comprehend, but try comprehending it when you just woke up as I had. There was a Dogman, but it wasn't our Dogman. A second Dogman, and it was threatening the girlfriend of our Dogman. I was so stunned, I just stared in amazement. What if the feral Dogman did her in? Would my friendship with Clyde return to normal? I felt immediately guilty for even wondering about that. I became aware of the other guys. They were urging Clyde to transform and go help his girlfriend. He was acting in a nervous and indecisive way. I felt, and still feel, this was Karen's fault. She had undermined him and weakened his resolve to the point where he had become almost denatured. So, he transformed all right, but he didn't grow in stature this time. He was still Clyde-sized as he went out of the bus and stormed over toward the feral Dogman, barking fiercely at Karen. As she saw Clyde approaching, she used the distraction to leap out of her sleeping bag and get inside the bus. Now, the two Dogmen faced off. Clyde, standing just under 6 feet tall, looking up at the 7 or 8 foot tall beast from the forest. The invader werewolf was colored as dark as night. When he walked into shadows, from our vantage point in the bus, the only parts of him which remained visible were the teeth, the claws, and the eye shine. This thing never stopped yowling and growling and barking and whining. It made noise throughout this entire episode. It stood, looking fiercely down at Clyde, and Clyde stood bravely, looking up at it. Then, the dark furred beast reached down to grab its opponent, and our friend Clyde squealed like a baby poodle and ran back into the bus, tail between his legs. Whoever was driving hit the gas and got us out of there, with the big black Dogman chasing us down the road for quite some ways. From what I've heard, that was the last time Clyde ever became a Dogman. He and Karen got off in the next town, and they got married. She made him get some crap job in that crap town, and they live there, or actually a few towns over from there, to this very day. Clyde is no longer the kind of guy who loves him and leaves him. Clyde now does as he's told, and is quite under control. Karen stays home eating bonbons and growing ever wider, complaining constantly about how hard her life is, and blaming Clyde for everything she can. There's no point in telling Clyde about any of this, since he's made up his mind that Karen is right about everything, and she must never be questioned. Me, I still work in music, I'm still unattached, and I'm available for dating. There are forces in this world far more powerful and destructive than werewolves and dogmen. There are forces out there like domestication. Domestication can end your fun and your adventures forever, leaving you with nothing but responsibility and guilt. I learned this firsthand because my best friend was a werewolf.
I know dogmen aren't exactly the same thing as werewolves, but the dogmen in these stories look just like werewolves, so maybe they were werewolves. You decide and tell me.
The Walking Wolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I know you people in New York City and other urban areas think of werewolves and dogmen as the subjects of scary stories and nothing else. But to me and my friends here in rural Pennsylvania, we have no choice but to think of it as something real. We all have to accept it as part of our lives. We all have to work around it. And on days when we are particularly unlucky, we have to encounter it directly. This is the story of one of those kinds of days. I have a friend who lives in Richland Town. Let's call him Rich. I live in a little place called Elephant, but please don't call me that. In between us is a Lake Nakamixon and a big state game land area, plus a whole lot of trees. One day we were walking back to Elephant along this little 2-lane road called Richland Town Road. The area is really a forest, but you keep realizing there are houses tucked away in those woods, more than a few. Still, those people live in the forest as far as I'm concerned. They're surrounded by vegetation and wildlife. I've seen all kinds of birds walking through there, and this one time, I saw something bigger than any bird. So, Rich and I had been in a goofy mood that day, joking around since we got up. I had slept over his place, and now he was walking to mine to sleep over there. It was the last weekend of the summer, and we wanted to make the most of it before school started in again. We almost didn't make it back to school. I had seen 3 dogs dancing around in the woods there one night a few months earlier, and I think they were coyotes, but I'm not certain. They didn't look like pets, and I never saw them again, but I still don't know. This night I was with Rich, however, we both saw this wolf, and we both instantly said, "Wolf," when we laid eyes on it. Neither of us had any doubt. The thing was huge. It was larger than a dog, and its head probably came up to our chest as it walked on all 4s from the trees out onto the road and stopped, blocking everything right in the center and staring at us. Its eyes glowed bright like eyeshine, but painfully bright. It was large, as I said, but it was a bit bony. It looked hungry, to say the least. I don't know how much food it takes to sustain a canine of that size, but this one wasn't getting enough. I won't call him scrawny, and he certainly seemed strong, but this was not the Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of dogman monster I hear you often talk about on your channel. This was just a frighteningly large wolf. Something that size doesn't need a lot of muscles to be something you don't want to encounter. It was colored like a wolf, largely gray, but with a lot of brown mixed in as well. It looked normal, but just way, way too large to be real. It looked like one of those movies where they stick a real animal on a set that's too small to make it look larger, but this thing actually was larger. Rich and I stood there, unable to go forward. If there had been any traffic, they would have stopped as well. We looked at the big dog, and the big dog looked at us. I whispered to Rich, asking him if maybe we should try walking through the woods around it. Rich told me that its eyes were glowing like a supernatural thing. He thought it was a werewolf and not a normal one. As we watched, the wolf sat down with a huff and returned to watching us. "Oh, look," I said, "he's getting comfortable. Maybe he'll be microwaving some popcorn next." Rich started talking about how we should just try to act bored and walk past it. If we acted like the alphas, maybe it would respect our authority and let us pass. I was like, "You first, dude," and to my surprise, he just started sort of nonchalantly strolling toward this giant monster. I held my breath and watched the big wolf to see what it would do. Well, the first thing it did was it got really surprised looking, with its eyes going all wide. Then it growled and showed its fangs and really long teeth in all their glory. This wolf reared back all in one motion, and then it was standing on its hind legs, glaring down at Rich and barking angrily. Still standing bipedally, He leaned his head way down and snapped at Rich, who backpedaled and quickly rejoined me. "Let's go," he said quietly as he walked right past me. I didn't get it at first, but then I saw that the dog was now walking toward us. It was still on its hind legs, but it was now walking toward me, and so I walked behind Rich, heading away from the dog and back toward Rich's house. I didn't want to break out into a run if I didn't have to, but I did manage to go fast enough to catch up with Rich. "Just calm down," he said. "Just keep walking at the same pace. Don't speed up, and especially don't slow down." "What was that you were saying about it being a werewolf before?" I asked him. He told me to forget he said that, to stop thinking about it. I only asked because I thought it might give us an idea of how to get away in one piece. But Rich was clearly frightened of the idea that we might actually be being followed by a werewolf. I wasn't really into the different monsters back then, so I was trying to remember what werewolves didn't like, what would make them go away. It wasn't kryptonite, that was Batman, wasn't it? I forget. I really at that time was into sports, video games, and girls, so I wasn't good at remembering the superpowers of mythological characters. I was grasping at straws because I wanted something to help me feel safe again. That thing sure seemed real. It was nearly 8 feet tall when standing on its hind legs, and it sure didn't look like it was a plant eater. I'd probably have a better chance trying to escape a mythical creature than that beast, so I guess I was hoping to find its magical Achilles heel. "We're never going to make it back at this pace," I said, and I suggested that Rich call his dad to come pick us up. Rich grimaced and said something about his stepmother and how she wasn't going to want to hear that. He was actually more frightened of his stepmom than the 8-foot-tall, hungry-looking predator trailing us. "I didn't say you should call your wicked stepmother," I reminded Rich. "I said you should call your dad." Rich's dad was the nice one, but he usually got overruled by his wife, who had a higher-paying job and was cranky all the time. The dog loomed behind us and started growling. I wasn't sure it wasn't his stomach growling. I begged Rich to call his dad, and finally he got scared enough to do it. Rich broke into tears at the sound of his father's voice and told him we were being trailed on the highway by a really big guy, and he wasn't letting us get back to where we were trying to go. While negotiating the concept of his dad coming to pick us up, the stepmom grabbed the phone away from him. She made Rich give her details as to where we were, and she said she was going to come pick us up and drive us to my home so she could have some peace for one night. That was fine with us as long as we got rescued from the wolf. Once Rich got off the phone, it was palpable that nothing had changed. We were still in some pretty severe danger. Our best option was still to try to keep walking in a bored and slow fashion away from the largest land predator that could possibly exist. The road was dark and long, and there had been no traffic in either direction for the entire time this incident had been going on. Heck, we hadn't seen a car on this street at all. It was the last weekend before school. Most families were at home, not out. "If it charges us, maybe we should run up someone's driveway," I said weakly. I mean, as a last resort. We started discussing whether either of us knew anyone who lived on this road, but neither of us thought so. I thought someone from Rich's homeroom lived in this one red house, but he said that girl moved away and never lived around there anyway. I was obviously confusing her with someone else I had seen him with. It felt good to be talking about trivial stuff. It made it seem as though life is a comfortable thing and that it goes on forever in a comfortable way. It made it feel as though death itself weren't almost literally breathing down our neck. This was like the O.J. Simpson slow-speed chase of Dogman encounters. The terror had us crying. It had us sweating until we were drenched. It had our faces red with stress and fear. But still, we plodded on, one step in front of another, trying to make it look as though nothing in the world were wrong. Glancing over my shoulder now and then, the creature was still there, its eyes looking like headlights 8 feet up off the ground. Every time I saw he was still there, a shudder went through my entire body and my temperature dropped another degree or two. One time after receiving this involuntary shudder, I turned and faced front, and I could have sworn I saw, cutting through the vegetation up ahead, real headlights. The headlights of a car. "Is that your dad's car?" I whispered hopefully to Rich. He said no, that looked more like his dad's wife's car. I said even if it was a stranger, we should flag them down anyway. This was kind of an emergency. The car drew close enough that we could see it was Rich's stepmother's car, and we broke into a run directly for it. She stopped in the middle of the road and we both piled in the back seat and shouted, "Turn around! Turn around!" Rich's stepmother had been lecturing us since before we got into the car and before we could even hear her. Then she switched to a lecture about how making a U-turn there would be illegal. We both kept screaming at her to drive, to make a U-turn, to do something. She just kept trying to speak more loudly than we were. Then the creature slammed onto her hood, having leaped up onto it. It put its canine head right up to the windshield and took inventory of the contents of this particular sardine can. I screamed. Rich screamed. Rich's dad's wife screamed. I'm not sure which of us hit the highest note, but it was like 3 ladies singing opera. I'm surprised the windshield didn't crack from all the vocalizations going on in that car. Rich's stepmom totally lost her mind for a few seconds, but when she remembered she had hands, feet, and a car, she started driving backwards on the highway. Since the werewolf was on her hood, not on the pavement, this did not succeed in gaining her any distance between herself and the monster. We both shouted at her again to turn around to make a U-turn. "And bring this monster home to my house?" she asked with indignation. "Not on your life, bucko." Her ego back in place, Rich's wicked stepmom got out of reverse gear and gunned the gas. The immense dog's face became one with the windshield for a brief moment in time, and then the creature lost its balance and hold on the car, tumbling off to the wayside. We saw it regain its footing almost immediately and begin to run after us on all fours. We screamed at our driver to please speed up, because that wolf thing was fast. It was so fast, I wasn't sure we were going to get away. In fact, we might never have if a police car, with its sirens and lights on full blare, hadn't started heading toward us on the highway in the other lane. It sped past us and was gone. Its appearance there was coincidental and had nothing to do with us or the Dogman, but it served the purpose of spooking the large creature. Rich and I kept an intense watch out the side and back windows, but we never saw the large wolf emerge from those trees again that night. Not on 4 legs, not on 2. Rich's stepmom dropped us off on my block, somewhat near where I lived, and sped off into the night to enjoy not being around her stepson for a while. Still, she quite possibly saved our lives. We were somewhat giddy as we walked down the block to my family's home. We talked about drawing the werewolf we had seen and watching werewolf movies and all this sort of stuff. As soon as we got to my room, though, we passed out. The experience had been a bit too much for both of us. There are a number of other stories from people I knew back then, and I saw something similar to that wolf creature one other time myself. But this was the scariest thing that ever happened to me. I never want to get that close to a Dogman or werewolf or whatever that thing was ever again. The Pennsylvania White Werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC. This is a story from my childhood that I had almost completely forgotten. It was the kind of story your mother tells you to forget about, and your father tells you couldn't have happened. At least, that's how parents would act back then. This is a story about seeing something you can't explain, and something that can't be explained. This is a story about my sighting of the Pennsylvania White Werewolf. When I was a kid, I lived in a small town I won't name, sort of near Allentown. It had woods nearby in several places, but it was a typical suburban town located close to what was then considered modern civilization. We weren't out in the boondocks, in other words, but, on the other hand, we had access to plenty of nature nearby. One night, the nature came over for a late-night visit. My two brothers and I had been playing ball in the yard all day. We would play imaginary baseball games where we would pretend to be entire lineups. For instance, my youngest brother would be the Oakland A's, and my middle brother would be the Cincinnati Reds, and they would imitate the batting stances of each of the hitters and go through the lineups that way. I would pitch to both, but if they were supposed to be a better hitter, I'd pitch more easily, and if they were a bad hitter, I'd throw hard and strike them out. We were weird kids, but we had a fun childhood. All day long, the middle brother and myself had been trying to explain to our younger brother that nobody had ever reported seeing a white creature when they reported seeing an abominable snowman. He kept saying the abominable snowman is white, and we kept telling him that was only in cartoons. He had seen Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, so he thought he knew what he was talking about. There are other far more recent examples of white abominable snowmen in media, but back then, the Bumble from Rudolph was the most famous one. We dropped our baseball gloves and bat and ball when we got called in for dinner, still arguing over the color of the snowman. It was the last Sunday night before school started again, and after dinner, my father insisted we all go out and pick up our baseball stuff, which we had left laying all around the yard. We complained that it was already dark out, and Dad asked what were we afraid of encountering in the dark in our own backyard. A ghost? That made us all laugh, and so out the back door we all scrambled, looking to get this boring job over fast. Well, we found everything except for my youngest brother's glove. It was dark around the edges of the yard, and both of my brothers were too scared to look under the bushes over there. I made fun of them and walked over to the edge of our property by a bush, and I gave them a final zinger joke as I prepared to bend down and look for the glove under this particular bit of foliage. Well, both of my brothers stopped laughing and looked horrified. They had stopped looking at me and were now looking past me and above me. Needless to say, I spun around fast to see what they were looking at, and my eyes were met with the most incredible sight you could possibly imagine. It was a white dog, but it appeared to be standing up like a man. It had a broad chest, more like a human than a dog, so maybe rather than saying it was a dog, I should say it was a furry man with a dog's head. Whichever it was, the creature was an albino. Its eyes exhibited a bright red eye shine, and every other thing about it was a pale white, including its impressive rows of long fangs. The creature made the strangest sound, almost like a whining sound. I know I should tell you it growled or something, but it didn't. It made this high-pitched sound as though it were very upset, and just as frightened as the three of us were of it. I think it was afraid we were going to do something to harm it, but it was 3 times our size. We ran inside, and of course neither of our parents believed our story. They felt it was something we made up to get to stay up later on a school night, and we were not taken seriously. But that was part of being a kid back in those days. People really didn't believe what you said, and they didn't care what your opinion was. Either you did everything you were told and you were good, or you inconveniently led a life having experiences like I did, which wouldn't have even made sense to our parents if they were the smartest people in the world. I mean, we spent all day talking about the abominable snowman not being an albino. Then, we all witnessed an entirely different kind of albino creature just as unlikely to be seen as the Mumble himself. I don't think my parents were entirely wrong in their gut instinct that this had something to do with school resuming. I really do think that the anxieties kids go through when returning to school can sometimes be so intense as to warp reality itself. And that one year, our collective anxieties and imaginations may have been what led to the manifestation of the Pennsylvania White Werewolf.
Hope that satisfied your lust for lichen lovers. This is Nancy Levonian in Hollywood saying, see you next Wednesday.
If you enjoyed this, please click like or consider subscribing. Remember to click the bell icon or you won't get notifications. If you want to listen to Bigfoot's secret uncensored story each Sunday, just go to peterbernard.com and become a paid subscriber. See you tomorrow. Same dog time, same dog channel.
Come back for more scary stories.